And today we'll be exploring tips around API monetization. We'll be featuring two experts on monetization best practices. But first, I'd like to set the stage a bit by exploring the state of API monetization in general. The API economy is not just smoke and mirrors. In recent years, leaders have realized that data and functionality has a lot of value. And if treated as a product, an API can offer impressive revenue streams. Lately, it's felt like sort of a gold rush to monetize some of these services. In fact, 42% of organizations are now monetizing their APIs. And impressively, APIs and API-related implementations generated 41% of revenue for organizations in the US. The API economy has been described as the next big thing. And if those statistics aren't proof enough, consider these others. That over 90% of developers are already using some sort of API, that there are over 60 API-first companies that have raised $50 million or more. And in the next 10 years, API monetization is scheduled to grow at a CAGR of 28%. And the API industry at large is currently valued at $6 billion and is projected to reach $72 billion in the next 10 years. Clearly, there is rising interest in API-first business models, but how exactly do we set up direct monetization? Well, monetization may seem simple, but it's kind of more complex than you think. There are numerous factors to consider, and determining just how to price calls is only the first step. Direct API monetization typically adopts a freemium model with price tiers above it. Some offer a flat rate pay-as-you-go model, while others offer a subscription. Some providers will also gate certain features for higher tiers. And not all requests equate to the same processing requirements. So to solve this, some services apply tokens, which is common for AI-related tasks. Then there's the challenge of actually setting up the payment and billing infrastructure itself. For this, I see four primary options. One is to add it to an existing API marketplace, or you could build your own payment logic from scratch. You could use a dedicated API-specific billing engine, or a lot of providers end up adopting a more holistic API lifecycle management suite. And if you'd like more information on this, this is from an article on our blog called 10 Helpful API Monetization Tools. And unfortunately, some companies rush to monetize these APIs and fail at setting up an equitable pricing model. Sudden price hikes like the ones we've seen at Twitter and Reddit recently can receive some backlash from the surrounding developer community, which harms your reputation in business. So in my opinion, it's best to keep pricing changes transparent to avoid unpleasant surprises and to give third-party apps ample time to respond to changes. Still, you may want to consider if direct monetization is even right for your API at all, because there are many reasons not to monetize one, such as dogfooding your internal services, or sometimes indirect strategies may be more profitable in the long run, like revenue share models, or building shared partner ecosystems. On the whole, an API monetization strategy really needs to be based on a unique value. You need a unique functionality, a great developer experience, transparency, and it's good to track analytics to improve the service over time. So there's my high-level overview of what to consider with API monetization. And to dive deeper today, we've brought in two really great experts with a whole lot of knowledge in this field. We have first up will be Mang-Git Ng, founder CEO of Anvil, talking about lessons from actually implementing API pricing in the wild. And so that'll be pretty cool to hear. And then we'll hear from Derric Gilling, CEO of Moesif, who will discuss how to monetize APIs and explore different usage-based billing models. So without further ado, yeah, I'll hand things over to Mang-Git.
Awesome. Let me get started here. I'm going to just go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. Great. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Looks good to me.
Awesome. So today, really just going to dive into some of the lessons we've learned while implementing API pricing at Anvil This is really, I want to say my expertise comes from making a lot of mistakes doing this over the years. And, not saying that we have the final answer, but we've definitely learned some things along the way and just wanted to share that. So before we get started, let's go ahead and just high level, what is Anvil? This will help set the context for how we think about pricing for our product. So Anvil is a complete platform for product teams to build software that automates document processes. And this really breaks down into a couple of products within the Anvil product suite. And they do everything from data collection to document generation to e-signatures. And then the nice thing is Anvil really allows you to integrate our product into your product over our APIs or embed it onto your website. If you'd like to learn more, definitely check us out at www.useanvil.com. So with that, let's dive into 3 lessons that we've learned over the years. And then also I have one lesson at the very end that's kind of like, okay, what did we get right? And what are we incorporating into our new pricing? So first lesson, I'm calling it make it match. And what do I mean by this? It really means your pricing should match your go-to-market. It seems pretty obvious that this is what you want. But when it comes to pricing, a lot of times, there's what everybody else is doing and then what you should be doing. And they might not always be the same. And in this case, we were pricing our product very much based on a usage-based pricing. It was completely priced in a way that was self-serve and no commitment. Whereas, with a sales-driven model, it's typically negotiated pricing. There's bundling and there's a minimum commitment. Now, the mistake that we made here was not realizing that the majority of our revenue was actually coming from sales-driven deals, and then pricing our product so that it was mostly for self-serve. It's a lower entry point, and wasn't really supporting our sales motion, despite the fact that our sales motion was the most profitable portion of our revenue engine. So this is our pricing from a couple years ago. As you can see, our pricing in the red box here was mostly PLG, API driven, usage based. And there's also the API tier with metered pricing. And we didn't mention any of the free usage on the API tier. Now, what was interesting is actually most of our revenue was coming from the contact us, because we had a bunch of features that these developers and product teams really wanted to use. And so they would reach out to us and then we'd put together a pricing package, but we were always getting dinged because our pricing was cheaper for the PLG model. I don't have it screenshot here, but like there's a usage price per use kind of number that was also on this page. And so we were constantly getting into conversations around, okay, why is it so expensive for the enterprise features when your self-serve model was XYZ price? So that's the first lesson, is make sure that your pricing, especially what your pricing is on your page, matches the go-to-market motion that you see working for your team. Okay, moving on to lesson number 2, keep it simple. Again, this might sound obvious, but especially when you're pricing something, and maybe because we're all engineers, you want to make sure you capture all of the value. But that just makes your product pricing very confusing. So the first thing is to limit your choices. We really had 2 ways of pricing our product, and this was represented on our pricing page. We had the teams plans, which is multiplayer, bucketed usage, and had features. And we also had the developers plan, which was single player, as in 1 developer account, metered usage, and we limited the features. And the mistake here was really there was too many options. people were very confused as to how the plans interacted or if they interacted. And neither package really fit either demographic. For teams, we're really targeting more of an SMB, self-serve, not super technical market, and developers was obviously a much more technical market. I think this is one thing to note here. Anvil is both a no-code and a API-driven tool. You have really nice UI to set up Anvil workflows and Anvil tooling. So we thought we could, split the difference and provide plans for both. So why don't we go ahead and take a look at our pricing that we created. So this was the evolution of the pricing. On the developer side, we had a bunch of different prices for each different kind of API request. Workflows plus eSign on the right-hand side here is actually a combination of workflows and etched PDF eSign. PDF filling and PDF generation are both the same price, and the 1,000 free actually applies across both of them. So that was very confusing and not indicated anywhere on this pricing page. This was supposed to be the developer plan where you could just sign up, start using it, and get paid at a metered price. Pay a metered price for only the amount that you use. Now, switching over to our team plans, you can notice that in this red box here, we had all of this bucketed usage and increase in users, and then it came at a different price point. This was extremely confusing because people were wondering if they bought a team plan, could they still use the API? This wasn't clear. This was really meant for a self-serve type model for people who are non-technical. Also, this was very confusing. The two different plans definitely did not play well against each other and caused a lot of confusion. So to this day, we still have people who are clearly developers signing up for team plans, and the developer pricing kind of just sitting there. Awesome. Lesson number 3, be consistent. So what I mean by this is standardized value metrics. And value metrics is just a quick definition for those who are new to this term. It's the unit of consumption by which the customer derives value. So we had usage, our PDF services API, a workflow submission, e-signatures. We kind of saw that on a previous slide with our pricing. But we also had features. And then we had feature limits within those value metrics and tiered access. What we realized was the features was what people were really interested in purchasing. And the usage was kind of like, okay, as they implement us, that will scale with their usage. And that's where we could make a lot of money. Our mistakes that we made here was there's too many caveats in our pricing. We were slow to wow, which means people couldn't actually experience our features, the really powerful features that they were looking to Anvil for. And the features were kind of confusing. So here's a slide of our pricing probably about a year and a half ago. And you'll notice that this price, the prices and features down here is very confusing, and there's a ton of caveats. Etched e-signatures are $0 if it's less than 2 signers, but $1.50 if it's more than 2 signers. There's workflow completions, 10 free a month, $1 with no signers, $2.50 with signers. There's just a lot of caveats throughout the pricing page that led to a lot of confusion. And this pricing page did not last very long. Cool. So that's a quick highlight of some of the main lessons we've learned over the years around, hey, pricing our API. I think one of the challenges for Anvil has been that this mix of no code plus API plus embedded that kind of spans, the freemium self-serve model, but also this API-driven model. But we've also learned a couple things that we think were really good and that we're implementing in our newest pricing rollout. So the things we got right, be generous. I think that was one thing that we were, we think we did a good job of. When we think about the other pricing pages that I showed throughout the slide deck, we were always offering a free tier. We were always offering quite a large amount of usage in that free tier. If you can see here on the right-hand side, this is a mock-up of what we're thinking our pricing will be. And you'll see here that we have a generous free tier with 10 free usage a month, 1,000 free API requests, PDF API requests a month. That's just available for everyone who signs up without even inserting their credit card. We did make it kind of consistent across both of the plans so that it causes a little bit less confusion, because when we had different tiers, different buckets, as well as different features, it just was a lot of things changing between plans. So we made it consistent. And we really wanted people to get value and be able to use our product and see why they should be using Anvil before having to put down a credit card. So that's why we have a very generous kind of free usage plan. The second thing was minimize the number of plans. You'll see we just have 3 plans here. You'll notice that our first rollout of pricing, we actually only had 3 plans as well, but that one was a little bit confusing for many reasons. Here, we really broke it down to 3 plans, and the differentiator between the plans is actually the features down below. You'll see down here, there's advanced features, and these only apply to enterprise and the scale plan. This is the thing that people were willing to pay for. So we were really excited to understand that and then be able to price for it. The last thing here is don't be afraid to charge. I think what we realized was that people were very excited about all of our high-end features, such as white labeling, security features, in-person signing, things like that, but we weren't really pricing them properly on our pricing page, which resulted in these very challenging conversations around, oh, well, your self-serve pricing is only so much. Why should I pay more? Why is there a platform fee for all these features? Your platform fee is too high. But in reality we really needed a platform fee that was at a threshold that could accommodate a sales-driven motion. Because if you think about it, in a sales-driven motion, you not only have to pay for your costs, but also you have to pay the salesperson a commission. So you have to have a certain price point for it to make sense. One thing I kind of skipped over and I just realized is that this area, this gray box here, are the features that are included in every single plan. So there's a lot of really nice features that we just include for everybody to use. And then the other thing that's not really displayed here is that our goal is to allow everybody to use every single feature in development mode and only have it be charged when you kind of want to turn on production. So that's a high-level summary of some of the lessons we've learned and kind of the new changes that we're thinking about implementing and kind of where we want to go with our pricing. Thank you, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you, Mang-Git. I really appreciate you being open about how you're setting all this up, and especially for a new company. I realize everything's always in flux, and like you're saying, these models are evolving, and it's really interesting, I think, for our viewers to see firsthand what that looks like. So thank you.
Absolutely.
So let's hand things over to Derric. And if you're tuning in live, feel free to write in some questions, and we're going to do a Q&A right after this presentation. So take it away.
Thanks, Bill, for having us today. Today, I'm going to be talking about best practices around API monetization and how do you better treat your API as products. Just quick overview of myself. I'm the CEO of Moesif. We're the leading API analytics and monetization platform. I'm mostly focused on API-first businesses, usage-based billing and pricing models, and PLG. And I'm over in San Francisco, so if you ever want an IPA, definitely hit me up. Here's my email. And today we're going to be talking about shipping an API product. And these are all the different concerns that we think about when we ship an API. The top level here are business concerns, which is trying to figure out the business model, designing the API, how do you actually grow and monetize the API and continue to iterate. The bottom half are the engineering concerns, which is actually developing, building, and deploying the API. Notice a lot of times there's actually a lot more business concerns than the engineering boxes itself, which means we have to really put a lot of investment into ensuring we have the right business model that is aligned to our go-to-market, aligned to the industry that we're in. So let's first jump into designing that business model itself. Each API business is quite different. So it's all about trying to figure out what to actually meter. What is the right value metrics to look at? Should you be thinking about postpaid versus prepaid? Should you do tiered pricing, pay-as-you-go pricing, when you invoice? As you can see, there's a lot of different variables as we think about designing a pricing scheme for an API business. But the most important thing here is first taking a step back and understanding, where do customers actually get value from the API? Here I listed a couple different examples of ways to implement use-based billing or pricing for an API. There's things like transaction volume, which is a number of different text messages sent, maybe it's number of video links sent. Example company of that would be like Cinch or Twilio. We also have other business models such as revenue or call share, which we see a lot in the financial and fintech space. A good example of that would be Stripe. We see Brex or Expensify, where it's actually a percentage of the revenue or transaction fee. Another good example of a use-based billing metric is data volume. Here we see this a lot within infrastructure plays. Datadog, for example, will bill on number of gigabytes sent to their service or number of log lines ingested. Another category would be user-centric metrics. These are things like unique users, number of people who are logged in, Slack, Segment, and a few tools that are more user-facing or customer-facing. A lot of times leverage these user-centric metrics. And lastly, if you're an infrastructure play, resource can be also a really good usage metric. So things like compute units, number of hours that a VM is running. But notice for every single one of these, it's again aligned to customer value. And think about, let's say you're building an email API. And there's two different ways you can actually charge your customers. Example one would be to charge on number of email templates stored in the email platform. So these are like different HTML templates, one for maybe sales and different campaigns that you might be thinking of using this API for. Another other example might be number of contacts reached or number of contacts emailed. If you go with the first one, what can happen is you have a customer that signs up, they store 100 different email templates, but they never ever send a single email. They never really got any value from the API. And that's why, aligning to what a customer cares about, which is emailing as many people as possible, might be better alignment to customer value. But let's first jump through billing strategy. Again, have you ever signed up for a cell phone service? You're going to have your companies like AT&T or Verizon, which are typically postpaid. Of course, also go buy a burner phone, which is typically prepaid with a number of credits. And when you set up a prepaid billing strategy, one of the great things is it's better cash flow for the business, especially if you're just starting out with a new product. It's also more familiar with enterprise. Right? If you look at traditional SaaS-based billing models, you usually pay for the month, for the year, maybe you have a multi-year agreement. So it's much more familiar with the enterprise sales process. But it can introduce a lot of friction during the onboarding flow, especially for API products where you don't know how much usage you're going to have for the month or for the year. So how do you even figure that out? And that's where this postpaid billing model can be really helpful, where you're actually allowing the customer to get started with your API and then deal with the usage amounts and quotas and everything else later. You're kicking the can down the road. So this can make your onboarding friction much less, makes pay-as-you-go business models much easier. However, there is credit risk that is introduced, especially if your API has high cost to serve. If you depend on a lot of expensive vendors, then it might be trickier to actually implement a postpaid billing model because you can actually have abuse around the API. The second element when thinking about the pricing model is packaging strategy. And there's two typical ways to package your API. The first here is your tiered pricing model. These are the traditional good, better, and best plan that we see with SaaS business models. And here we can actually enforce a minimum spend. So especially if there's high support costs for the APIs, we can say at least it costs $10 a month or $50 a month. So you're able to enforce that minimum spend. It's also a lot more predictable for your customers. They know exactly what they're going to pay, and they can self-select, am I a startup? Am I an enterprise? Am I a hobbyist? They can see exactly what they get, and they don't really have to think about volume and usage requirements. But it can recreate friction in expansion itself. Let's say a developer signs up for your first plan, which is $100 a month, but they get $300 in value from the API. Well, that delta is now $200, right? So of course, they're getting a positive net increase in value by signing up for your service. But now let's say your next tier is $500 a month. Well, remember, they're still right now at $300 in value. So if they sign up with a $500 a month plan, then they're going to be net negative in the perceived value that they get from your service. So you can see there's this lopsided stair-step function where customers might not want to upgrade because they don't see enough value to do that jump. And that's where pay-as-you-go can be really helpful, because now you're actually aligning their value to the cost that they pay, right? It's a very smooth function. And so it's much more efficient for the customer, and it seems a lot cheaper. They really only need to pay for what they use and nothing more. There's a big issue with these use-based billing models, though, is it can upset customers, especially if you don't manage that process, right? You don't want a developer to sign up, expect they're going to pay only $50 a month, and then you get $10,000 a month bill. Like, now they have to explain that to the manager. So how do you manage that process to make sure, there's a good, healthy ramp in usage, but it doesn't suddenly have a 500% spike in 1 week? The last thing is invoicing strategy. And there's two different ways to do this. Again, there's a recurring model, which is more aligned to your SaaS-based pricing, and there's threshold-based. Threshold-based was introduced, especially with, you have the ad market, where you would say, bill me every $500, regardless of whenever the calendar is aligned. On the recurring side, the great thing there is it's much easier for accounting department, right? So you know exactly that the API was consumed in this month, and I can attribute it to that month or that quarter and that year. It's much more predictable for your customers because now they know exactly when they're going to get that invoice. But it can actually have bad unit economics, especially for low-cost SaaS, right? So if you want a developer to get started and pay just a couple pennies, right? Twilio was really great at doing this, where you could get started and just send a couple of text messages, and each one is less than a penny. Well, how do you handle this? Do you send an invoice for the month? Or they send only 3 text messages, and they have to have like a 5-cent invoice? So that's where the threshold billing model can be really helpful. We're able to batch a lot of those different transactions into a much larger invoice and only pay that once that threshold is reached. You can do this with prepaid, which is in Twilio's example, you're buying a certain number of credits and then you consume those over time. Or you can do it as more of a postpaid model, which is in the ad tech space. Once your spend reaches, say, $500 or $1,000, you get an invoice. But it can be much harder for your finance team, especially when we think about things like GAAP accounting. So we talked about just the initial business model already, but now let's actually talk about how do you actually grow your API business? And this is one of the challenging things, given it's actually quite different than what we've seen before in the last decade with SaaS-based models. Selling to developers is hard. Developers have so much more authority over the tools that they get to pick, right? Buying is much more decentralized than it was 10 years ago, whereas up to a department head or engineering manager. The second piece here is developers can build these specialized apps themselves. No longer are SaaS vendors selling a general purpose platform to an entire department. Instead, it's very specialized and targeted use cases that they can build. And developers expect immediate value, right? They don't want to wait for a 90-day, pilot or POC before they can even see anything. They want something immediate, right? And this is just partly due to today's society of expecting immediate gratification. Lastly, a lot of the value is seen through APIs. So if you're going to charge in just a per seat model, that might not make sense if a customer is expecting to only have 1 or 2 seats, but a lot of value is delivered through automation, AI, and trying to actually drive efficiencies at the organization. But the other tricky thing is developers need buy-in from many different stakeholders besides themselves. So even if you're trying to get the end user, the developer involved, there's still a lot of other folks behind those developers that is driving that decision making. There's legal and security review. There's things like the ROI, the risk versus, should we build in-house versus buy a third-party solution? There are things like the finance and procurement department, right? There's different project priorities that may come up. So how do you make sure you balance all these different things? One of the great things is with a self-service model is you can sidestep a lot of these things during your onboarding flow. So for example, instead of dealing with legal and security review, just have a very simple click through terms of service, allow a developer to sign up and get started immediately. Maybe it takes 10 or 15 minutes to start playing around with the API in a sandbox or demo environment. Instead of being concerned about product priorities and project priorities, have a very simple and fast integration process. Simple plugins, simple integrations. Even though you're providing an API, you should also provide different integrations with technologies they're already using, different SDKs and plugins. Make it stupid simple for them to get started. Lastly, instead of dealing with finance and procurement and trying to sign a 1-year agreement from day one, get them started on a manager's credit card, have them pay a token amount. Maybe it's just $10 a month or $50 a month. And so what you're trying to do is land a lot of developers first. Just get them started with your platform and get them to put their credit card down as quick as possible, even if it's just during a 7-day trial or 14-day trial. They're already able to see value, then you can grow with those customers. But sales does not stop here. Just because you got some developers using your product does not mean you have a scalable business. The key is you need to sell through your existing developers and try and discover what makes sense to get to that larger ACV. And that might mean expanding their usage. It might mean finding new enterprise requirements. This might be security requirements, compliance requirements. It might be new use cases, new teams that are able to use your API or platform. Right? So sales is really trying to look at your existing customer base and finding and identifying those folks that make sense to engage with sales. And this is what I call the PLG flywheel or the API flywheel. In this case, we have a 5-step process to growing your API. Step 1, make sure your customer sees value initially, right? So this is getting them to get that aha moment. And then they're going to naturally start growing their usage, right? They start off with, that $10 a month plan, but then over time, they go from sandbox stage to production stage, and that usage starts increasing. And that's when sales starts engaging with these folks. Notice that this is already after they saw value with the platform. They already integrated. They already are expanding the usage. Then sales get started trying to identify new use cases, new teams, new requirements, and that allows for accelerated usage expansion, right? Now you have new teams on board, new use cases, and that continues to accelerate that usage. And then you go back to step 3. Sales engages again, finds more use cases on top of the initial use cases that were discovered. And then again, accelerated expansion. So you have this flywheel where sales keeps engaging, identifying new use cases, which continues to accelerate the usage of the APIs, whether it's trying new APIs or expanding the usage of the existing APIs they already integrated. So both breadth and depth of usage is important. But there's a tricky thing here with when you start landing a lot of these developers is how do you manage account management? Right? So there's going to be issues during onboarding. Developers are going to run into 400 errors, 500 errors, going to have questions about the API. There's going to be changing business needs. They want to invite other folks outside of maybe engineering. Maybe there's a customer facing team that might need custom applications or workflows. There's going to be these billing surprises, that $10,000 a month bill that I talked about earlier. How do you manage all these different things? And one of the best ways is to try and manage it through self-service, right? Embed these directly within your product. So instead of having just customer success reaching out to customers to manage their quota, give them the power to see that directly within their app. So the developers themselves can see how are they consuming your service. And so they can set up maybe billing alerts. They can set up or investigate why the quota was consumed, in a very rapid time period. So provide them the tools so they're in charge. Similarly, with quota management, we can send out emails, right? Notify them. Hey, your quota had a big spike here. A lot of it is being used. You're going to have a billing surprise here. So allow them to be notified or over communicate is much better than to under communicate, right? The last thing I want to talk about is metrics for API products. We already talked about building out the pricing model. We talked about the growth strategy, but how do you make sure you can measure the KPIs and iterate on your product strategy? There's a ton of different metrics around there. If you ever set up, Datadog, observability player, you're going to have lots of stuff around SLAs, performance, uptime, errors, all that type of stuff. But these are aligned to engineering concerns. These are infrastructure metrics. They're not necessarily aligned to product goals and business goals. And so when we think about KPIs, it's really important to align to one of these three areas. We have adoption metrics, we have engagement metrics, and we have retention metrics. All three of these are going to be important for any product leader. One might be more important than another during a certain quarter. Maybe this quarter, adoption is the important piece, but maybe next quarter, retention is actually the priority. And so these might flip back and forth depending on the company goals. But just speaking on adoption itself, the main thing here is trying to reduce that time to hello world. So how long does it take for a developer to sign up, get started playing with your API, and sending that very first API call? So we call that time to hello world. And that might mean just sending an API call through Postman or curl or a tool like that. But then that doesn't necessarily mean they're getting full value out of the API. They just got started. And that's where we get to this third stage here, which is time to working app. Some folks might call that time to live or time to revenue service. And what that is it's a time for a developer to get to a fully working prototype. They can share to their manager, they can share to their colleagues, something that they're proud of. And that might mean, in this case, we created a set of criteria, which it's over 100 payment transactions. And this was taken out of a payments API. But if you're a communications platform, it might mean sending over 100 text messages. Notice that's way beyond sending that very first API call through Postman. So trying to understand what is a conversion rate and how long does it take for a developer to get to that last step? Because before that, it's very, very hard to convert a customer to paying if they haven't seen any value yet. Engagement, again, this should be tied to the business value that a customer gets from the API. Notice here, I don't have API calls, right? I don't have requests per second because your customer does not care about requests per second or requests per minute. In fact, if the request per minute was too high, it might be because of health probes. It might be because they're using the API wrong. Maybe you have a batch API, but they're using the single event API. So each of these are aligned to the customer value, right? So if you're e-commerce platform, a good engagement metric might be looking at checkout conversion rate, right? How many different merchants have a high conversion rate? If you're a SaaS API or data API, it might mean by looking at the number of integrations using the API, or how many different integrations the customer uses. For data API, it might be match rate. What is the accuracy of those API calls? Was it found in the database or not found in the database? Lastly, for logistics, it might mean looking at how many different orders were fulfilled and successfully fulfilled versus how many were maybe for whatever reason canceled, right? And so this is, again, what customers are looking for versus infrastructure things like requests per second. Lastly, we want to make sure our customers can grow with us a long term. And so there's different ways to look at retention. And here I'm plotting your typical retention curve, which is breaking down by cohort. What that means is looking at the sign up date of the developer, right? And so then tracking their usage week over week or month over month. So in this case, at week 0, of course, retention could be 100% because that is when everyone signs up. But then when we go to week 1, we see that there's a large drop off. For enterprise, it drops down to 75% of that cohort is still engaged with the API. I mean, they're still sending data or making API calls, doing something with it. But then when we look at the self-service segment, that drops down to 38%. So of course, there's a very large drop off after that very first week, because a lot of folks, maybe they couldn't solve the use case, maybe they ran into issues, but notice how it actually flattens out. And a good retention curve should flatten, or sometimes it even looks like a smile, right? So once we get to week 8 and week 9, we see that enterprise is still hovering around 80%, self-service is hovering around that 30 to 40% mark. If this retention curve goes all the way down to 0 by the time we got to week 8 or week 9, that means we have a retention problem. And another way to look at that is you have a leaky boat. You have lots of folks signing up, but they're not sticking around. The ship is sinking. And so that may mean instead of investing in top of funnel and adoption initiatives, it might make more sense to focus on why are people not staying around? Why are people leaving? Lastly, we're going to talk about what's the last stage here. Do you iterate or do you deprecate? And hopefully, you can iterate on the API, continue to add new endpoints, continue to add new features and functionality that customers asking for. But at some point, you're going to have to deprecate an endpoint. Usually, we don't want to piss off developers, but the best way to make sure you don't piss off developers is don't break their stuff. No one wants to wake up at 3 in the morning because the integration broke, right? So handle deprecation gracefully. One of the best ways to do this is over communicate. Do in-app notifications, email. You can add HTTP headers, letting them know that this API or this function is going to be deprecated soon, and give them plenty of headway before that API is actually shut off. Quick intro, we're the leading API analytics and billing platform. So if you are looking for ways to grow your platform, feel free to ping me. My email is right here, Derric Gilling at Moesif.com. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Thank you, Derric. I like that you focus so heavily on API analytics and monitoring, especially when it's concerning our topic of monetization today. And like I mentioned in the chat there, Derric has submitted some great posts to the Nordic APIs blog on covering a lot of the metrics that he was talking about in the latter half of that presentation. So yeah, definitely check that out for more insights. Some interesting parallels I was noticing between Mang-Git's talk and Derric's talk was that a lot of this boils down to being really good about self-service. I just thought that was an interesting kind of thing tying both presentations together. But in order to find value, one of our listeners was wondering, and you both touched on this a little bit, how do we find that initial customer value that people would want to pay for with these APIs? And should it be done with customer interviews, or is there some sort of maybe automated monitoring that could help? Derric, do you want to start answering this one? Sure.
So, I always say you need both qualitative and quantitative feedback. You can't just rely on one versus the other. And so, as you're thinking about launching a new product or API, doing customer interviews is of course very important. Trying to drill deep into, their use case, why are they running into, these current challenges and problems. Of course, one of the problems with customer interviews is you can have inherent bias, especially as you start to scale, because you can't talk to every customer. Not every customer is going to want to talk to you. They're busy. They have things to do. We're all professionals here. And that's where that quantitative feedback can be super helpful, right? Trying to track, who is actually getting started with the API, how long does it take them, which functions or endpoints are they using, and then looking at, not just what they're doing, but who are they, right? Is it the fact that a different industry is using API differently than other industries? Maybe you're going after both health tech and fintech, but you notice that health tech is always using these APIs, but fintech is using this other set of APIs. And then that also gives you metrics and data points to loop back into your customer interviews. You can ask those folks, why are you using these APIs? How come you didn't use these other APIs? And they might give you some valuable insights.
Interesting. Mang-Git, any ideas on how your team is trying to find that value?
Yeah, I mean, I think like going back to Derric's first response, which is qualitative, right? I think presumably when you set out to build a product, you've done some qualitative type interviews with potential customers before you've gone out and built the product. So in our case, we were building, we knew what product we were building and what the product was supposed to be doing. And therefore it was pretty clear what are the items we should be charging for. Now, what wasn't clear was, I think, initially we probably picked too many value metrics, right? We were like, hey, we want to charge on this, which is API, PDF API generation and submissions, but we also want to charge on users because people are used to that. But we also want to charge on this other thing. And that just ends up being too confusing. So the hard part is actually to cull the number of metrics that you're using to the core value metrics. And I think that really comes back to Derric's second point, which is quantitative, right? You can see what people are using and why they're signing up and what they're doing once you have your product out there. But I think before you have your product out there and you're trying to sell it, it's pretty hard to get the quantitative stuff. So you got to start with the qualitative stuff.
Cool. Mang-Git, I also liked in your presentation, you talked about keeping it simple, stupid. Like you guys tried to find that value and enact it in practice. So I also noticed you kind of moved away from the pay-as-you-go method to more of the prepaid tiered model, if I understand it correctly. Was that just for keeping things simple, or was it making accounting easier? What was kind of the impetus behind that transition?
So it's actually we're moving towards a tiered model with a pay-as-you-go component on top.
I see.
So
okay.
The tiers are really paying for access to features, right? The first tier is really access to our platform. You can use everything, right? The second tier is, hey, I want to embed Anvil on my website. I want to be able to customize it, white label it, do all that kind of work. So you're paying for those features, but the usage metrics and the price you pay for the usage is still the same. So that translates. And then obviously there's the enterprise here, which is, hey, more of a prepaid, I would say, and you get kind of enterprise benefits there as well.
Cool. I mean, that's another point, is like you can combine these strategies that Derric was mentioning in his talk. It's not just always one or the other.
And Bill, we've actually seen that quite a bit, even when we work with our customers who are thinking about, how do I roll out use-based billing? This blended approach where, you might have certain features or functionality that it has to be prepaid. Maybe there's high, setup costs. Maybe they already have a UI-based product already out in the wild. And so you're trying to figure out what makes sense for your different pricing levers. And that might mean having a prepaid component that is based off of features. And then there's this extra usage-based component, which allows you to accelerate the expansion revenue piece, right? Because then again, you can grow with your customers. But it's not necessarily just a one or the other.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Building on top of that real quick, I think another thing I've seen out in the wild is really just, minimum commitment. It's like, regardless of how much you use, you're going to pay $300 a month, and we'll start pulling from that bucket until you go over, and then it's kind of metered usage after that. So that's another one I've seen, which is less so like tiering on features, but really saying, hey, we need you to pay X amount in order for this to be, profitable or make business sense for us as a business. So you're going to have to pay that much.
Yeah, because I think like Derric was saying, sending 5-cent invoices is not going to be profitable or worth it for anyone involved.
Definitely, especially when you think about the support costs, how do you, because you want to be able to provide a really good customer experience for all your customers. But, if there's a lot of folks that are just, spending $1 a month, it doesn't make sense from a business standpoint. And it's a disservice to the customers that do want to use your API at a high level in production.
Seems like there's so many nuances when we're putting together an API pricing model. It makes me question if something like this can be standardized at all, or is it too unique to the business model at its core? Because Derric, you were breaking down the different pricing models and how they relate to, APIs by different types of APIs. And Mang-Git, obviously we've seen like the progression of your guys' model and how it's undergone a lot of changes. So yeah, can this be standardized by common tooling, or do you think pricing and API is just a little bit too nuanced and you really got to take the reins on it yourself?
I would say, there's two different facets to it. When it comes to the actual invoicing, do you do prepaid versus postpaid? Do you do pay as you go? That is easily standardized, right? And so, for us, Moesif, we're a use-based billing platform and analytics platform. So we support all that, but we put most of the investment in the metering piece itself, right? In the actual, how do you figure out the value metric, which might be really sophisticated. We have folks that, they have this particular field that's set and they want to, calculate some, metric from that field in the API payload. And that's very, very unique to each business, because one business that is in health tech might be looking at things like patient records or number of locations. But, if you're a data API, it might mean, looking up in a database, and not only is it an API call, but what's the match, how many records were returned, and trying to figure out that business metric. And that's a really important piece when we think about these API businesses, is aligning the pricing, the analytics, what you're tracking internally to the customer value. Yeah.
And like you said, a lot could get lost there. I mean, how should we be pricing calls that get a 500 response,
Definitely no.
Definitely no. Service reliability issues there.
Yeah.
And all that needs to be like transcribed somewhere, and it needs to be documented correctly and invoiced correctly. So totally, I agree. There's a lot going on there. Yeah. What about for you, Mang-Git? I mean, also, are there any like tools or vendors or infrastructure that you would recommend when it comes to monetizing an API?
Yeah, I mean, let's answer that last question first. I mean, I think we have Derric on this call right now, and that's probably one of the best tools out there for monetizing these APIs. But I will say, in terms of standardization, I think, Derric clearly has a lot more insight into this than we do. He sees it across multiple companies. But there are certainly best practices, and sometimes maybe it's not even best practices, but it's just like, what is the general populace accustomed to, right? There's also effort in educating your customer on a new pricing model, and that can cause friction in buying. So I think the traditional SaaS model has always been seats, right? You buy Salesforce, it's like, how many seats do you want? Maybe one person never logs into Salesforce, you're still paying for that seat. And as you move towards API pricing, it's, it often seems to be more aligned with usage-based, right? It's usage-based, postpaid and it's really like the AWS, GCP kind of model, but it's confusing, right? It takes a degree pretty much to understand how much you're going to be paying at the end of the month. And so I think there are best practices. We've adopted this good, better, best kind of model with our pricing. I think we've tried it throughout various iterations of our pricing, but really, the biggest thing is simplify your pricing so that it's understandable, because that itself can be a blocker for somebody buying your product. If they don't understand your pricing, they might just not put down the credit card.
Cool. And that's a really good point, just having it as simple as possible, because if you have 10 different things that you're charging on in terms of usage metrics, then I don't want to have a finance team and a mathematician to just figure this out. What is my projected bill, for the next quarter, for the next year? At the end of the day, business need to plan around this stuff. And so, and also it's what makes sense for your industry, right? So, if you are infrastructure, we do see, things like gigabytes or maybe compute used makes sense. But, if your end user and your customers is the sales team, then, charging by the gigabyte would probably not make sense, because that's not an industry norm, right? When most sales teams are charged by per seat, or maybe it's by contacts or something along those lines. So just doing what makes sense for the business.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's going to be dictated
One
by context.
One comment on that I was going to say is, like, it's often hard to walk away from the value that you think somebody is receiving, right? And we see this a lot with our product, which is, depending on which industry you're in, the value that the person using Anvil is receiving is very different. Like, if you're in the financial services industry, having a document signed, having a contract signed is probably worth hundreds to thousands of dollars for that person. But if you're in the, let's call it invoicing industry or something where, or like a receipt industry, you're generating receipts with Anvil, right? Like, each one of those need to be negligible cost, right? So, really at the end of the day, it's pick one, and then pick which direction you want to go, because trying to split the difference is going to be really, really difficult for you. You have to figure out a way to, especially early on, to capture enough value that this makes sense as a viable business. And then maybe down the road, you can start, stratifying your product offerings to better target specific verticals. And I think like Salesforce does a great job of this, where what is the difference between the financial cloud and the healthcare cloud? Like, it's probably the same thing underneath. Yeah. They just like rebranded it, right?
Yeah,
and they charge different amounts.
Maybe they organize some components around.
Yeah.
The great thing about APIs is you can be specialized. You can adopt that niche functionality on the onset. And it's probably the best route, I agree, for starting out. Something I wanted to get into while we still have a little bit of time here is the whole sales onboarding process. I recently saw an interesting article on TechCrunch entitled, "Have Enterprise Buyers Finally Soured on Bottoms-Up Tech Sales?" And it was kind of talking about the API economy in reference to all of this, and how we focus so much on self-service that we might be missing out on that more historic enterprise top-down led sales funnel. So yeah, I'm curious to get your take on if you think that's actually true, and what, if anything, your businesses are doing to cater to that different type of non-technical user that might be out on the other side of the sales funnel.
I can take this. We actually have two sales processes that are run in parallel. And to answer the question, no, I don't think bottoms up business models are done, but I think bottoms up business model founders sometimes don't appreciate the sales process. And so when I think about a go-to-market for API business, it's really around having a bottoms up or POG motion with sales assisted, right? Because you need both pieces to work. And the example I like to give is, consider a customer comes to your site, requests a demo, or maybe signs up to start playing around with the API, and one of two things happen. Option one is they get started immediately. They're able to set this up in a sandbox environment and pay a token amount. Option two is they can't do anything because maybe they're in a regulated industry. They have HIPAA compliance, PCI compliance, different things that they need to focus on. And that's where it definitely makes sense for sales to get engaged, to set them up with maybe a POC or something where, it has those right compliance requirements met from day one, so they can test it out. But even going back to the self-service developer, they're totally able to get set up, running in a sandbox environment, but it's still up to sales to identify those folks. Hey, this is someone that's been increasing the usage, maybe it's 25% week over week. Now sales can actually reach out to those folks. Hey, let me just, I want to be consultative here. let's just understand your use case more. Let's just have a working session. Again, it doesn't need to be salesy. It's not necessarily about trying to sell more features. It's just understanding their business and why are they using the API. And then sales can actually work that to identify maybe there's new API they could be using, or maybe they can solve it better than how they're solving it today. And that goes back to that feedback loop. So sales identifies good opportunities from their self-service user base, has a call, identify new use cases, and then that accelerates their usage because now they're adding new teams, they're adding it to new products, new offerings, and then that goes back into sales continues to identify, the leads that make sense to work with.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you had that 5-step process to go through where I think it was number 3 is where those sales engineers start to engage. And yeah, because when you think about it, a large organization, there might just be one department taking advantage of this API and people might not be knowledgeable of it across the board.
Exactly. And, folks talk about land and expand even before, APIs businesses were a thing. And this was more from the SaaS world, but, I would say APIs is like land and expand on steroids. You start with a developer, he has a problem that he's trying to solve. And he's probably trying to solve that because, a manager or someone told him this is the priority for this sprint or for this quarter. But then it's up to sales to really, try and expand that use case to the broader department or the broader organization.
Cool. Yeah,
I just want to comment that. Yeah, I just want to comment that, even in a sales-driven motion, let's just hypothetically say your company has an API and it's completely sales-driven. You still want to make it easy and self-serve because developers just, they don't want to talk to people. They want to see the value. They want to go play with it and see the value. And they might sign up with a personal account. They might sign up and just test it. And the thing is, what you really want to do is to make the developer a champion for you in their organization when the organization is making the decision on what to buy, right? And so we see that work well for us, which is by the time the decision to purchase is being made, the developer's like, hey, look, you want to go with something else? I'm going to be very upset. Like, I know how this works. I want to use this. Their APIs are great. They have good documentation. Can we just use Anvil, right? So I think that's a big part of it is like, you still want to make it easy. You still want to make it self-serve because at the end of the day, there is work to be done to integrate an API. APIs are not, point solutions. They're not like buy this and then suddenly you can do everything. APIs almost always require work to be integrated into a product. And so I don't think bottoms up is necessarily dead. It's just like in this scenario, bottoms up means something different. It means that you're aligning people internally to make that purchase.
Cool. That's a really good point. And, it's perfectly fine for API business to have an SDR team, reaching out to whether developers or engineering managers, the director, whatever it is that you want to reach out to. And it's not about just getting the demo, right? It's just getting them exposed to your use case. And they might sign up, start using the API completely on their own terms. It might be at, 12 a.m., on midnight on a Saturday, because, that's how developers work. And so if the SDR team is just trying to push it for a demo and they never respond, well, there's a lot of stuff happening behind the scenes, even though they never responded, right? And so to the point is, make it stupid simple to get started with the API. And I like to use the term, sales is really selling through developers. They're not selling to developers. It's just a very subtle but big difference, which is it's exposing developers to this idea that you solve a use case, get them excited, turn them into a champion, but then sales team, they're not really trying to get the developer like selling directly for this $10 a month plan. It's working with them, selling through the developer to identify what is a bigger opportunity at the company. What are they really trying to do? What's driving the developer to look at the service?
We had one more question come in. If we could grab that, that'd be great. It's what are different processes or ways to arrive at specific numbers for pricing after deciding upon the strategy? And how long would that take if it's iterative? Mang-Git, you talked about this quite a bit. I feel like you could have an answer.
I don't know if I have a good answer. I think for us, what we did was we really surveyed existing the competitive landscape, and took a look at, hey, how much does any of the other e-signature providers charge? How much does a web form builder charge for a submission? And like, what are the differentiators? So I think that's what we did for our metered pricing. That's kind of how we thought about it. And then also just testing. I mean, I think testing the pricing with customers, that's something that you can do really easily on a sales call. It's a lot harder to do from a website landing page that like somebody goes to and decides it's very binary, right? But you don't know what went into that binary decision, binary outcome that you saw. But if you're in a sales call, you can really test the pricing and hedge kind of what you're saying to then be able to walk it back a little bit if it's like clearly way overshot the price, or if it's below, you kind of shot yourself in the foot. But at least you can read people in that sales call.
Cool. Good advice. All right, you guys, I think I'm going to wind things down here, unless you have any other comments on API pricing best practices. I feel like we covered a lot of great ground.
No, I think that was pretty much it for me. I mean, I know Derric had his email, but if anybody has questions, wants to reach out to me, feel free. It's Mang-Git@useanvil.com, and happy to jump on and respond.
Awesome.
Same here. Pleasure being here, Bill, and hopefully everyone has a good rest of the week. Feel free to reach out to my email, derric@moesif.com, if you have any questions on monetizing APIs and usage-based billing.
Fantastic. All right, I'm just going to do a couple more updates about Nordic APIs here. First off, the Nordic APIs Platform Summit is back this October. After a few years of hiatus, we're super excited to resume this yearly event in Stockholm, Sweden. Attendees can expect a ton of excellent API-related talks. I've been personally helping review the speaker submissions for the event, and the agenda is looking great. So you can learn more and register at nordicapis.com. And if you like today's insights, check out our blog for more details. We've been covering API monetization and other API-related topics for like 10 years there. So there's a lot of content there, and we're constantly updating it. We're also open to publishing articles from the community too. So if you'd like to learn more about that, visit our Create With Us page. I also maintain a bi-weekly newsletter that sums up a lot of what we're covering in the blog and events like these. So consider signing up to that through the website as well. And last but not least, thank you to our sponsor, Curity. You can learn more about their OAuth server and identity management services at curity.io. All right, thank you, Derric. Thank you, Mang-Git. See you around.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.